So, you're telling me I'm under arrest for trespassing on the very dirt my grandfather bled to keep. That was the moment I realized the world had officially tilted off its axis. But looking back at that officer's confused face while Brenda stood there in her silk robe, pointing a finger like she'd just caught public enemy number one, I couldn't and oppose. T helped but smile because I knew something she didn't and oppose. I knew that in about 5 minutes her entire carefully constructed empire of spite was going to come crashing down in a way she'd never recover from. You see, my name is Silas, and after 15 years of handling logistics for the 101st Airborne and a divorce that felt like losing a limb in a slow-motion car wreck, I just wanted a place where the only thing I had to worry about was whether the trout were biting or if the roof needed another coat of sealant, which is why when I inherited the old homestead on Blackwood Lake in northern Michigan, I thought I'd finally found my sanctuary. It's 40 acres of ancient hemlocks and cedar, a little patch of heaven where the air smells so clean it actually hurts your lungs at first. And for the first 2 years, life was exactly what I needed. Just me, my old dog Buster, and a community of neighbors who understood the golden rule of the Northwoods, which is to wave when you pass on the water and mind your own damn business the rest of the time. But then, the peace didn't and oppose. T just break. It was shattered by the arrival of Evelyn Vance, a woman who didn't and oppose. T just move into our neighborhood. She invaded it like a conquering general with a penchant for beige siding and overpriced patio furniture. She bought the old Miller place, tore down a perfectly good 1920s cabin, and built this architectural monstrosity that looked like a suburban Dallas office park had been dropped into the woods by a confused giant, a 3-story limestone eyesore she called, in quote, the pinnacle, in quote, though the rest of us just called it the fortress of gloom. Within a week, Evelyn was and oppose. T just a neighbor, she was a self-appointed deity, patrolling the shoreline in a pristine white pontoon boat, wearing these blindingly white linen suits and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, which were as cold and calculating as a winter frost. I was sitting on my dock one Tuesday morning, just nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and watching the mist rise off the water, when I heard the low, aggressive hum of her motor, and before I could even set my mug down, she was pulling up alongside my weathered cedar boards, looking at my 1994 Lund fishing boat like it was a pile of radioactive waste. End quote. Good morning, neighbor, end quote, she said, though the word neighbor felt like a threat coming from her, end quote. I and oppose. I'm Evelyn Vance, president of the newly formed Blackwood Estates Homeowners Association, and I and oppose. I'm afraid we need to have a little chat about your aesthetic choices, end quote. I just stared at her for a second, wondering if I missed a memo or maybe suffer stroke because there has an end oppose. T been an HOA on this lake since the dawn of time, and I told her as much, quite politely at first, explaining that my family had been on this land since the Great Depression and we weren't an oppose. T much for joining clubs, but her smile didn't an oppose. T flicker, it just hardened into something brittle and dangerous. End quote. Oh, Silas and oppose. It's not a club, it and oppose. It's a necessity for protecting our investments, end quote. She chirped, pulling a thick leather-bound folder out of her lap as if she were about to present a peace treaty, end quote. The board has voted in your unpaved driveway, that rusted-out boat, and the general, rustic state of your dock are now in violation of the Tier 1 standards. So you'll need to have these rectified within 30 days, or we'll be forced to initiate the fine structure, starting at $200 a day, end quote. I felt that old heat rising in my chest, the kind you get when you're staring down a superior officer who's about to give a disastrous order, and I just stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and told her that if she wanted to play dress-up and pretend she was the queen of the lake, she could do it on her own property. But if she stepped 1 foot on my dock again, she'd be finding out exactly how combat vet handles a trespasser. She didn't an oppose. T scream. She didn't an oppose. T even flinch. She just looked at me with this chilling sort of pity and whispered, end quote. We'll see how brave you are when the county starts putting liens on your precious dirt, Sergeant, end quote. And then she gunned that engine, sending a wake so hard it nearly tipped my coffee into the lake. That was the opening shot of the war. And over the next month, Evelyn turned the lake into a tactical battlefield, sending me certified letters every other day, filing complaints with the DNR about my, end quote, leaking, end quote, boat motor, and even calling the fire marshal because I had a stack of firewood and too close to the property line. But she wasn't and oppos. T just targeting me. She was going after everyone. She threatened Mrs. Gable, an 80-year-old widow, over the color of her bird feeders, and she tried to sue the young couple down the way because their kid's plastic slide was visible from the water. She was smart, though. She used legalese that sounded just official enough to scare people who didn't and oppos. T know better, creating this atmosphere of fear where people were afraid to even sit on their porches for fear of violation notice, And that's when my old logistics training kicked in, because in the Army, you don an oppos. T just charge a fortified position, you scout it, you find the supply lines, and you find the one brick that, if pulled, brings the whole wall down. I spent a week at the county clerk's office, a dusty basement that smelled like old paper and bureaucracy, making friends with a woman named Barb who'd been filing deeds since the 70s and knew where every skeleton in this county was buried. I told her I was looking for the bylaws of the Blackwood Estates HOA, and she just laughed, a dry, wheezing sound that gave me more hope than any legal victory ever could. Honey, there ain't an oppos. Tino Blackwood Estates HOA, She told me, sliding a manila folder across the counter, That woman filed some papers for a non-profit corporation with that name, but she has an oppos. T got a single covenant on a single deed in this township except her own. She's been running a bluff, trying to trick people into signing and oppos. Voluntary joinder and oppos. Agreements that give her power over their land. But legally, she's got the authority of a wet noodle. But as I dug deeper into the property records, I found something that made my heart skip a beat, something so perfectly ironic, it felt like the universe was hand-delivering me a gift. You see, when my grandfather passed, he didn't an oppos. He just leave me the homestead. He left me a 51% share in a holding company called, Great Lakes Heritage Trust, an entity I'd largely ignored because the dividends just showed up in a quiet account every month, and I'd assumed it was just some old timber investments. I called up my grandfather's old attorney, a man named Elias who looked like he was carved out of a piece of oak and spoke with a voice like grinding gravel, and I asked him to pull the full portfolio of the trust. And when he walked into my cabin 2 days later with a stack of papers and a smirk on his face, I knew the war was over before it had even truly begun. Silas, Elias said, settling into the old rocking chair by the fire, Your grandfather was a very quiet, very wealthy man who didn't and oppos. He liked people knowing his business, but he owned a lot more than 40 acres. He bought up several key lakefront parcels back in the 90s through this trust, and it turns out that and oppos, the pinnacle and oppos, that limestone monstrosity Evelyn Vance calls home, it's not hers, I blinked, What do you mean it's not hers? She's been acting like she owns the world, She's a high-end tenant on a long-term commercial lease with a purchase option that hasn't and oppos, vested yet, Elias explained, tapping a finger on a signature line that bore my grandfather's name, The trust owns the land and the structure, she just pays the rent, or rather, she's supposed to, because according to these records, she's 3 months behind on her lease payments, and she's currently operating an unlicensed interior design firm out of the basement, which is a direct violation of the residential-only clause in the agreement. I sat there for a long time, listening to the wind howl through the trees, feeling this strange mix of relief and cold, hard justice, because the woman who'd been trying to evict me from my own peace was actually living under my roof, and she didn't an oppos. To have the slightest clue that I was the one who could pull the rug out from under her white linen suits. But I didn't an oppos. Rush over there. I've learned that when you have the high ground, you wait for the enemy to make the final mistake, and Evelyn, bless her arrogant heart, didn't an oppos. Disappoint. She decided to go for the nuclear option, to make an example out of me, calling the sheriff and claiming I was a, dangerous, unstable squatter, who had threatened her with a firearm, which is how I ended up with 2 squad cars in my driveway at dawn and a very nervous deputy asking me to step away from the porch. I didn't an oppos. Argue I didn't an oppos. Fight. I just invited the deputies inside for coffee and showed them the security footage from the dock, the DNR report she'd faked, and then, with a shaking hand, I handed them the deed to my property and the articles of incorporation for the trust. Deputy Miller, a local guy who'd known my grandfather, just sighed and rubbed his eyes. And quote, "Silas, I oppose. I'm sorry, we have to respond to these calls, but that woman is driving us crazy. She's filed 22 reports this month against half the lake. We knew she was a piece of work, but we didn't oppose. T knows she was lying about the HOA." End quote. End quote. "It gets better, Miller," end quote, I said, sliding the lease agreement across the table, end quote. "I'd like to report a tenant who is currently in violation of her lease and potentially committing fraud by misrepresenting her authority to local law enforcement. And since I'm a majority shareholder of the entity that owns her house, I think it's time we served her some papers of our own." End quote. The look on Evelyn's face when we walked up to her front door 10 minutes later, me, the deputies, and my lawyer, is a memory I will cherish until the day they put me in the ground. She was standing there on that limestone balcony, clutching a glass of green juice and looking down at us like we were peasants coming to pay tribute, and she actually had the audacity to shout, end quote, "Have you finally come to take him away, officers? I told you he was a menace," end quote. End quote. "Actually, Ms. Vance," end quote, Deputy Miller shouted back, end quote, "we're here to keep the peace while your landlord serves you an eviction notice and a cease and desist for operating an unlicensed business and impersonating a homeowners association officer." End quote. She didn't oppose. Move. She just froze, her face going from that smug porcelain white to a shade of gray that matched the lake on a stormy day. And as Elias handed her the packet of papers, I stepped forward, looking her dead in the eye, and for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. End quote. "Evelyn," end quote, I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the morning air, end quote, "you spent a lot of time talking about aesthetic standards and property values, but you forgot the most important rule of the woods. You never try to burn down a man's house when you're living in a glass one that he owns. You have 30 days to pack your beige furniture and your fake HOA folders and get off my land. And if I see that white pontoon boat on this side of the lake again, I want an oppose. Call the cops. I'll just call the repo man, because it turns out you've been missing payments on that, too." End quote. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The whole community came together like a dam had broken. Mrs. Gable brought over a peach cobbler. The young couple down the way helped me clear out some brush. And the end quote, Blackwood Estates HOA end quote, vanished like a bad dream. Evelyn tried to fight it in court, of course. She hired a big city lawyer who tried to argue some obscure tenant rights clause. But when the judge saw the evidence of her harassment campaign and the bribery she'd attempted with a local zoning official, something barred at the clerk in oppose. S office helped me dig up. He didn't oppose. T just uphold the eviction. He ordered her to pay damages to every neighbor she'd harassed. She left in the middle of the night, a U-Haul truck snaking its way out of the trees, and the end quote, fortress of gloom end quote, sat empty for a year before I decided what to do with it. I didn't oppose. T want to live in it. It felt like it was stained with her bitterness. I did the only thing that felt right. I turned it into a non-profit retreat for combat veterans and their families, a place where guys like me could come to find the silence they needed without someone checking the length of their grass or the color of their boat. But here's the thing that still gets me, and the reason I wanted to tell this story, because even though justice was served and the lake is quiet again, it made me realize how fragile our peace really is. We live in a world where people think that if they yell loud enough or use enough legal-sounding words, they can own you. They can dictate how you live on your own land and who you're allowed to be. And it makes me wonder how many other, in quote, Evelyn's in quote, are out there right now, tricking people into giving up their rights just because they're afraid of a piece of paper with a red stamp on it. I'm curious, though looking back, did I go too far? Some people in town said I should have just let her stay if she paid the back rent, that evicting her and exposing her in front of the whole lake was, in quote, cruel, in quote, for a woman who was clearly struggling financially. But then I think about Mrs. Gable crying because she thought she was going to lose her house over a bird feeder. And I wonder when does, in quote, standing your ground, in quote, turn into, in quote, revenge, in quote. Is there even a difference when someone is trying to ruin your life? Anyway, the trout are jumping tonight and the hemlocks are whispering in the wind. And for the first time in a long time, the only thing I have to worry about is whether I've got enough bait for the morning. If you've ever had to deal with a neighbor from hell or an HOA that thought they were the Supreme Court, I want to hear about it because I think the more we talk about these people, the less power they have. Tell me your story in the comments. Tell me if you think I was the hero or just another bully with a bigger stick. And if you want to hear more about how we turn the pinnacle into a sanctuary, stick around because that's a whole different kind of battle. Just remember, check your deeds, know your neighbors, and never, ever let someone tell you that your peace, ISN, and oppos, worth fighting for.